Hi everybody, and welcome to this addendum of the Next.js video. In this addendum, as the name suggests, we're just going to add a few more things to what we've already done. We've seen how we could write a front end to a back-end API server. In our case, we're looking at that GitHub repository information, so we can get information about users. Let's just expand on that a little bit, and then we'll also learn how to handle post requests. So those are the things I'd like to cover in this addendum. So let's get started. So here's where we left off. So we have this GitHub user search that we wrote, this little front end to the GitHub API. And it enables us to get information about users. Like if I search for Not Waldorf, we get a picture of her and some basic information about her. If I search for another user, I get some information about her. Now, the GitHub API includes other options where we can get additional information. Like, for example, we can get information about a particular user's repositories. And let me just show you that in the browser, and then we'll write some code to get that information. So that API is this. It's that API github.com users, not Waldorf, kind of what I did before. And if I go repos here, I get a big long list or an array of JSON objects. Each JSON object is representing one repository. And one thing we might be interested in is, well, what's the Stargazer count for that repository? And let me just search for that. So I'll search for Stargazers count. And the first repository has a Stargazers count of 118. The next one has 0 Stargazers count, the next 87, the next 8, and so on. So let's say I want to get all those and add them all up to get like the total Stargazers count for all the repositories of a user and display that in this information page that we're constructing. So let's see how we can do that. So here's our utils.js that we were working on before, and let's just add to it. So the first thing we need is a different type of promise, and I've already installed. I've done an npm install Bluebird. So if you're following along, you may want to do this. Just do that npm install Bluebird. Once you do that, I'm going to import that. The Bluebird promise. We'll see the use of this shortly. So let's write some code that'll get those repositories from that GitHub API. So this one will just take a URL, and we'll get that information. So we'll fetch and once we fetch it, then we'll execute another function that'll take that response. And let's just console log it for grins. And the important part of this function is that we're going to return it. So it's going to go to that GitHub API repositories page and fetch that information and then just return it. So that's the goal of this function. And let's just write a function that'll call that function with a username. So we'll call it get repos, and let's say it does take a username. And that simply returns that get JSON with, now we give it that URL, and let's see if we can do this. That's https API github.com/users/ and the variable is username. Right, so that was just what we saw in the previous, when I was showing you it in the browser. So that looks good. So now we got all those repositories from GitHub, and we want to count that Stargazer count field. So let's write that function. So it takes that array of repositories. And here we're going to make use of a function called reduce, which is similar to map in that it applies a function to each element in an array. But in the map case, it returned an array of an equal size. In this reduce case, as the name would suggest, it reduces it to one value. So repo is for each repo. So we're just incrementing count by the repo.star gazers count. That looks good. And the initial value of count is 0. Okay, that looks pretty good. Okay, and finally what we want to do is write a function that calls all these functions. Not the function get profile on top there that we wrote last time, and this get repos and get star count. So let's go ahead and write that one. And let's call that get, well, let's call it a function for some user. And here's where we're going to use that B promise. And we'll use one called all. So what all does is it waits on multiple asynchronous functions. Usually when we have a promise, we're waiting on one asynchronous function. This will enable us to wait on multiple ones. So the argument we're going to have here is a list or an array of asynchronous functions. So one of them is that get profile. And that argument is going to be user. And the other one we're waiting on is that brand new one that we have, get repos. And that also takes the argument user. So once we get those return values back, then we're going to execute another function. And because we call two things, get profile and get repos, those things return two things. So that's why I have this list here. So the get profile will return, let's call it profile. And the get repos will return the repos information. So that's where that stuff comes from. And that function will return a JSON object that consists of the profile and of the stars that we want, which would be, we're going to call get star count. And the argument is the repos. So that looks reasonable. So again, this function get user data is going to call get profile on top and the get repos. Once it gets those results, it'll return that JSON object, which includes a function called that get star count. So that all looks great. And the last thing we need to do is export this get user data. So here in module exports, instead of returning get profile, we're going to be returning get user data. Okay, and that all looks wonderful, so I'm saving it, and let's give it a try. Okay, and I'm hoping for the best here. Let me go to home, and I have this user object. Let me click there, and fantastic, I have a star count, and I do have that profile still, and I have all that information. So let's see if I can display it, if we can say stars and how many stars there are. So let's work on that code. So that's in our pages file, our index. Okay, so here's where we need to fix things. So before I do any fixing, let's just try the code as is to see if we have any errors. So we're thinking that we will need to add the star count, but here I do searching, and now no information is being shown. And the reason is that we've kind of changed the structure here. Instead of user being all the profile information, we kind of have a subcategory of profile and stars. So we need to do some edits even of the existing code we wrote here. So let's see if we can do that. So this state.user, that should be, let's say this state user name, it would be this state user profile. dot name, this state user profile avatar URL, this state user profile dot company, this state user profile dot bio. Let me just save that and make sure that works. Okay, we got all that information back. So now we want to display the star count, so let's do that part. Let's do that under here. Let's add another paragraph tag and say stars. And that would be this dot state dot user dot stars. I think that's what we called it. All right, let's give that a shot. Okay, let's try that. So that worked, stars 2394. Let's try another user. Oh, I misspelled it, Kozierkov. Got her, she has stars of 71. So that looks great. So what we've done here is just kind of add a little bit of utility to our, that's kind of a weird word because it's utils.js, but we add a little bit of extra function to our util.js where we call the additional API, and we've done a little manipulation of the data using a reduce function. So just kind of exercise what the stuff we know. Now let's look at some just kind of basic stuff of how we could do a general post request. And let's do it outside of any Next.js. We'll just do it from the command line. So I'm creating a new file here, and let's just call it sample1.js, and I'll stick it not in lib, but in that next template code. Okay, so let's see how we can do this. So first we're going to require the isomorphic-fetch package. We've been using that already. And now let's write a function that gets the information. So function get info of some URL. This should be pretty boilerplate by now, and you predict what's happening. So oops. Then once we get that information, we have a function that has response. Okay, so that's pretty much the most basic information we can, or the most basic fetch function we can write. Okay, and now let's write a function that calls getInfo. So let's call, that'll be a async function. Get user info, let's call it. It takes a user and a town, say. Get info, it'll take that URL. So we have to construct a URL, and this time it's one that's just on my local machine. And it takes 2 arguments. This is what I wanted to really illustrate with this code, which is how to make a simple GET request. The GitHub one illustrated it, but I just wanted to illustrate it once again to kind of reinforce how it works. So I think it's user equals okay, that looks really pretty nice. Let's say the only thing I want to do is console log that. Okay, I think that's good. And now let's just call it from the command line or from this file. So we'll call get user info and it's just going to echo this stuff. So, and from Minneapolis, let's say. Let me save that. Sample1.js. Okay, let's go to the terminal and see if that works. Okay, here my server is still running, so let's shut it off. And we called it sample1. And it just returns that, as we are predicting, this little JSON object. So what we were just demoing, which was fairly simple, was how to construct a regular GET request. So that's fairly simple. All right, so let's see how we can create a simple POST request. So let's open up a new file. Well, let's save it as something so we get some syntax highlighting. And let's call it ex2.javascript. All right, great. And we're going to require that isomorphic-fetch package. Sweet. And now we want to write a POST request that'll handle that API we wrote before that does user login. So username and password. And we've done that on server side. Let's just see how we can handle that using fetch. So we're going to write some isomorphic-fetch code. And we're going to need a function. Let's call it getLogin. It'll take that user information like the username and password. And for a POST request, we need a few more odds and ends than we do for a GET request. Remember, the GET request does things in a header, and now we need to send things in a body. In order to do that, we need to set up a few things. So the first thing we'll need to set up is a header. So it's going to accept some JSON. And the critical thing here is we were going to URL encode that body text, so we're going to specify that. So that's content type. There we are. And that content type is going to be that URL encoded. So that's application/x_www. Okay, so that looks good for the header. Now we need more the body of the text. This is where the parameters are, and we're going to let's call them search params. So we're going to create a new object, a new URL search params. And the argument is going to be that user info that we just sent into that function. So that's going to be the username and password. So that's kind of the precursors, the things we need before we actually send a fetch request. So let's do that. We'll fetch that result. We'll do a return fetch. So here's where we put the URL of our local server in this case. So that's the login method that we created. And it's going to take a JSON object as an argument, just saying what type of request it is. So the method is going to be a POST request. The header will be that header stuff we created up above. And finally, the body is that search param stuff. Sweet. That looks good so far. So after we get that information, after we get the results of that fetch, then we'll execute this function. So it's going to have some sort of response. And what we're simply going to do here is just return that response. That looks good. And now let's write a function. It's going to be an asynchronous function that's going to call that function we just created, get login. So let's call this one check login. And it's going to take the username and password, that JSON object that we've been working with. And let's, just for fun, just console log that user password. And let's call that asynchronous get login function. So we'll await for that response. And once we get that information, we'll just simply console log that what we got back. So that's pretty easy. So let's just call that function now from this file, which would be check login. And now we need to give it a username and password. So the username will be, I think it was Anne, and the password, let's give an incorrect password to start with. Let's say Anne's password was guitar. I think Anne's password is password, but let's give that a shot. So again, this is just an example of how to construct a post request. So let's see if this works. Sweet, and that looks pretty good. So Anne's password isn't guitar, so we got that username not found. Let's try a correct username and password, which I think is Nancy and guitar. And that one works, so that's good. We are successful. So let's recap what we've done here. So in this video, we looked how we could generate slightly more complex API queries. So we created that, we used GitHub and we found the repos and we created the star count. So we've had a bunch of functions there that created what we needed for our little front end. And then we moved how to kind of do that GET request. So it's a repeat pretty much of the GitHub, but I just wanted to reinforce it and show it another way. And this last one is how to do a post request. So after this video, I think you should be pretty comfortable writing fetches that get either GET request or post request. So that was the point of this little addendum. See you in the next video. Thanks. Bye.